All right, everybody. Welcome to our webinar about the end of the 2022 legislative session. What we're doing right now is we just have a couple minutes before everybody comes into the room here. Not the room here, the room digitally. So we're going to start sort of right at 9. One thing that's very important at 12 noon. 9 is the time when things start, and that's not why that's stuck into the brain. So one thing that's very important to know is that there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for us, you can just pop it into that Q&A box, hit send, and we will ask it during the webinar, which will start at noon, as has been previously established. So I'm looking at my person who's keeping the time. We're very close. We're 1 minute away now. Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to our webinar, the end of the 2022 legislative session. What happened and what's next? My name is Mia Wolf. I have our experts here. What's going on is we have a pretty tight camera shot, so I'm going to move off camera in a moment, and then you'll just hear the sound from me for the rest of the webinar. What you should know now, though, is that you do have the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, right? So if you want to pop a question, and we will ask it live on air. I'm going to move off, and then we'll talk about who we are speaking with. All right, so we have 3 experts for this particular panel today. The first is Doug Clark. Doug Clark is the leader of our government relations practice here at Shanker Russo and Clark. Before entering private practice, he was the assistant counsel in the Assembly Majority Leader's office and the senior associate counsel for Assembly Ways and Means Committee. Then we have Ed Draves. He's the one that's going to be, he's on one side of the screen. I forget it from here or not. Mr. Draves is the Director of Government Relations. Prior to joining SRC, he was a partner at Bolton St. John's for over 20 years. The Buffalo News once called him one of labor's most savvy political operatives, end quote. Finally, we have Phil Bullock. He's going to be on the other side. He is the Director of Public Policy at SRC. He lobbied extensively on New York's medical marijuana program, as well as the full legalization of adult use cannabis. In 2020, City and State magazine named him an Albany 40 under 40 rising star. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
All right. So again, we want your questions. There's the chat box in the bottom. We will ask them live on air. I want to start out by talking about the politics, and then we'll sort of reflect that through the policy. How do the politics affect the policy? First thing I want to ask. This year, we saw a record number of bills pass both houses. It was 1,006 in total. And you said this happened against a backdrop of quote unquote total chaos in Albany. What do you mean by that? And why were so many bills passed anyway?
Yeah, well, I think that the total chaos was on the political side with reapportionment. And I think the fact that that completely blew apart at the end of session was pretty chaotic for everybody. You know, the big old joke is what the politician worry about? Number one is getting reelected. Well, they had to know where to run to even become reelected. And so that was incredibly chaotic. And I think it's amazing if you look at how they were able to get through the session, pass a record number of bills with that backdrop. And also did it in a way which I found is like, the biggest change of having Governor Hochul so far is that there was not a lot of sound and fury. They worked diligently behind the scenes. They got things done. There wasn't a lot of name calling and those type of things, which the last administration was really, really good at. And they got a lot done. It was impressive.
All right, so we've got redistricting. What else made this a chaotic session?
Well, I mean, you still have the COVID rules in effect, so you're sort of hybrid here, not here. I think one of the things that actually is a counterbalance to the chaos is the fact that, you know, the Senate majority now has been there a bit longer, and, you know, things are more established. Even within a COVID context, you know, they have the machine is running smoother. You know, does the machinery of a legislature ever run that smooth? Well, no, but you know, they're I don't want to say getting the hang of it, but you know, they're falling into processes and ways, and even within the COVID context, doing better with that. And the Assembly, to a certain extent as well, they have a growing conference, which is still amazing to say. But now it's, back to the politics, growing in slightly different branches. And we'll see tomorrow about, what are the effects of some of those branches, specifically branching to the left. There's primaries and other things that will be decided tomorrow, and we'll see what comes of that.
All right, just because we have to this year, I want people watching this on record to know, we're talking about the June primaries in 2022.
Yes.
There'll be other ones in August, we'll get to that later. Doug, I want to go back to you. So 1,006 bills, but everyone knows there's a distinction between quality and quantity, right? So we passed big bills on bail reform, gun control, a ban on crypto mining, but we left on the table clean slate, privacy, and sweeping environmental legislation. Is the dominant story of this legislature bold legislative change, or was it big progressive priorities left undone? And what does that mean for next session?
Well, I think it depends on which end of the spectrum that you sit. I think you have to start initially from the premise that, especially with such a diverse Democratic conference, it's difficult to do any sort of big, broad, sweeping, all-encompassing legislation. And because it's difficult to wrangle all of your various constituencies on the same page, and not just on the same page broadly, but on the same page specifically. So if somebody's part isn't included in any one of those things, is that enough to blow it up? And I think what you've seen is a bit of, and this also feeds into the chaos of redistricting and all of that. You didn't know what you had to do for whom and who was doing it, if that makes any sense at all. So generally, it's difficult to do big things. It's very difficult to do them with a diverse caucus. And then finally, it's really difficult to do it when you don't know who's part of that diverse caucus and who's representing whom within that caucus. So, I think the story, if you want to give a headline, is that if you measure the effectiveness of a legislature by the amount of things that it does, and I don't know that that's necessarily the best way to measure it, but it is a measure of it. The Brennan Center has used it to measure it, for example. Then yes, this is a successful legislature. A lot of these things will continue to be discussed, and we'll see where they go. It's also easier to do bigger things in non-election years. So, next year could be a year for bigger, broader, sweeping things.
All right, Phil, I want to move to you because we talked already just briefly about COVID. Fewer lawmakers are talking about it though, so we might be the only ones. Before the webinar, you said there is a process of relearning this year that went on, the old ways of lobbying. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think when COVID initially hit, we were all obviously taken aback, but also trying to navigate how to do what was best for our clients. And with that in mind, I think a big part of that process initially was, okay, how accessible do you need to be via the phone now to get a hold of staff, to get electeds, to make sure your client can get a hold of you. And now, as we've seen sort of these easing of restrictions, the Capitol hasn't been fully, filled again by electeds, but there are folks back up there. So it's the process of going back up and pulling folks off the floor and being able to sort of navigate the Capitol. But also, we were talking a little bit about this, it requires a level of knowledge that I think we haven't had to necessarily deploy before to know where folks are more than ever, to be able to get answers quickly, to bring stuff back, because during COVID, I think everyone was looking to us to be able to return answers and regulations and executive orders as quickly as possible. And that sort of has just continued on in our cases since COVID has sort of wound down.
How about the other two? COVID, where are we this year and how's that affected things?
Well, I mean, there was, as Phil said, a general loosening up there, but there was still, we had a couple of times clients actually come into Albany and they would have this weird hybrid day where they would go up to the Capitol and they would meet in rooms with legislators, just like the old days. And then we would come back to our offices and we would go on the Zoom and Zoom, an office that was 2 doors down from that office that we had just been in. So there was this weird mix. And I think that, as Phil was saying, you really had to understand what legislator you were dealing with and how they were dealing with the pandemic. I mean, the Assembly actually had conferences and in-person conferences, and this Senate will have gone an entire, session, 2-year session without actually physically meeting in conference. So, you have this weird mix of things, and navigating that and understanding that was a key part of being effective.
But yeah, theoretically, there may be members who have never actually been to Albany. I mean, I don't think that's actually true, but it's theoretically possible.
So that brings us to my next question. How is COVID having shaped 2.5 years of session, right? What's happening to the careers of the politicians, both the newbies and the veterans? How can we see the influence of it?
Well, I think we'll see beginning tomorrow how it's affected the influence of members, because not only are they not doing things in person here, the traditional way of politicking and working your district for 2 years, you haven't been able to do it. There are no dinner circuit that you go on. There aren't fundraisers and things like that you go to. All the things that an elected normally does within their district, involving meeting a lot of people within the district, you couldn't do. So it'll be very interesting to see that perhaps those people who are running, who are maybe more tech savvy, maybe have more of a digital presence, is that going to overwhelm things like incumbency and things like having a record and other things that you would traditionally point to, because the way of getting yourself out there is so, and has been so different. There has been, of course, this tug between the two before COVID, but COVID really sort of put the thumb on the scale for one particular side. And we'll have to see how that all plays out. Who knows? That's why we hold elections, to see what happens.
All right, absolutely fascinating, Matt. So the other reason you might not have been able to do all your pancake breakfast and whatever is you didn't know who was going to be in your district for this election. Now, Doug, this feels like it all happened forever ago, but could you briefly remind us what happened in the redistricting story this year and how did we get to where we are now?
So it depends on when you want to start the story, but if you start the story going back to the creation, the constitutional creation of the Independent Redistricting Commission, and how it was designed and whether it was intentionally set up to fail, I'll let other folks make that determination. But it became pretty clear pretty quickly that the commission was not going to come to agreement on lines, and therefore, under the terms, it threw it back to the legislature. The legislature, acting pretty swiftly, but under the timeframes under which they had to act, it was a pretty tight time frame anyway, drew lines, approved them, and then, of course, court challenges came. Oddly, the court challenges focused specifically on the Senate and congressional lines right away, but not the Assembly, which is why we ended up in this weird hybrid of primary days, where we create a new primary day for the Senate and Congress, but the Assembly and the gubernatorial primary day stays the same. There have been subsequent cases that say the Assembly lines also will need to be redone in 2024, but for now, it was too close to undo the set primary date. So, we're just making it up as we go along, as we're supposed to.
So very much a story unfinished. I only want to talk to you about a part of that story, which is that there was a day that the Court of Appeals, the highest court in New York State, said these congressional and Senate lines are no good. What happened on that day, and how did it affect the offices you were working with?
I think you could hear a scream coming from the Capitol from everywhere. No, there was a moment where I think anyone who's in this space in any capacity, advocates, electeds, lobbyists, etc., we're all exchanging text messages of, is this going to stand? What's this going to mean? We're all looking over, the paperwork involved with it. And then I think immediately after that, conversations with the offices for meetings we were setting for clients, things started shifting a little bit. And can we do this a couple of days from now? What's it going to look like? Because folks had to relearn, again, what we were talking about. Folks had to learn where they were running, what their constituencies were, how they were going to approach, the last few weeks of session. So it was chaos in a very real sense. I think, again, they had a productive end of session. They figured out how to go through it, but it was certainly unprecedented.
All right, so you've made a very interesting point there. It's like, what do you do if you're a lawmaker and you have this new district and it's sort of late in the game and you've just found out? And I'm wondering, what is the process of thinking that through? And I want to go to Ed first for this one.
Well, I mean, I think what you saw, and I guess we could use the Manhattan district in New York, the congressional district of Nadler and Maloney as a perfect example. Is you take a random judge in Steuben County, and then you have him pick somebody from Pittsburgh who is a quote unquote expert on doing this, and then decides to draw lines. And in New York, for time immemorial, the way you divided up Manhattan was you divided it east and west. We even talk about, we live on the west side, we live on the east side. It's east. That has been since the beginning of time. And then what you do is you have somebody draw a line that says, no, the way Manhattan is divided is actually the way the communities are is north-south. And we have never done north-south. And he chooses to do north-south and takes Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney and puts them in the same district. And both of them traditionally have the same allies, the same supporters, and they're suddenly thrown together. And you saw that around the state in the way that districts were divided up. He did not look at what we traditionally do. He didn't look at seniority. He didn't look at who the electeds were, where they were. He drew lines that created quote unquote the most competitive districts and districts that had a continuity, but they're not the way that we do. So if you're a politician, you take that, you see what percentage of that district is still yours, and you look at what those numbers are. And if you're Jim Tedisco, you look at where you live and you decide you don't want to run against Neil Breslin, and you go and you take on Daphne Jordan. And if you're Sean Patrick Maloney, you decide to go in a different district and run against an incumbent Democratic member. I mean, so people made quick calculations about what district they felt that where, not even depending on where they live, but where they thought they could run to win and whether or not they could run to win. And you saw members retire because the districts that were cut for them were no longer viable districts for them. So people had to make, and as Phil said, this was in a very short amount of time, had to make decisions on whether or not they were going to run in the district and whether or not they were viable in that district or were they going to go district shopping. So a lot of stuff happened and a lot of alliances that were long-term. The Maloney Nadler is a perfect example. Those guys have worked together for years and now they're in the steel cage death match. So, that's what happens.
Wow. So is there a relationship between people making these calculations and the sense that we might have the session sort of lost steam at the end, on the state level at least?
I don't know that it necessarily lost steam. I think, because the other thing that we haven't thrown into the mix that increased the chaos was, of course, the compressed time frame when everybody thought they were going to have a primary in June. So, the normal momentum building that goes on during session where, it peaks in the last week. Well, the last week is suddenly the first week of June. And, that just upped the ante for everybody. So I don't, in a certain way, I don't think it could have lost steam. It was, without completely falling apart and, getting nothing done. And, it actually is kind of remarkable that they got done what they got done, given all of the things that they had to deal with. Because remember, not only did we have, there was a brief period of time where the special master's lines came out, but you could still make some changes. And so you had this brief period of time, like, well, people trying to, make some reasoned arguments to either the judge or the guy in Pittsburgh, actually my district should, or this district should look a little more like this, and here's why. And, some members were able to make such arguments, others were not as successful. And so within the context of everything, it's really remarkable that the amount of things that got done and the amount of topics that they did deal with.
I think that's Doug's been around a long time. We always talk about, oh, Stanley Fink was such a strong leader, and in fact, what you saw from both the speaker and from the Senate Majority Leader is that they had really strong teams in place, right? So while this chaos is going on, they knew that they wanted to get specific pieces of legislation done, and they needed to keep the trains running on time. They had a truncated time to do that. And I think it shows that in the midst of this hurricane that was going on with the members, the staffs and the leadership worked really, really hard to make sure that the priorities that conference wanted to emphasize for that election cycle and what they needed to get done as far as work got out the door. And I think that was very impressive.
Brilliant. So we have a question from somebody out there in the audience. Their question is, how did the new progressive legislatures that were elected recently change the way session was conducted? So I'm thinking this is a question about process, but take it however way you would like.
So, I mean, I don't, this is sort of asking, pick one thread out of a suit and tell me, what effect it has on the suit entirely. Because you have all these other things that we've been talking about, the schedule, COVID, redistricting, all of these things feeding into this. So I think it's a little bit difficult to isolate the variable of the progressive members. I mean, you saw early on, a year and a half ago, there were some issues with leaks from conference, which frankly were always happening, but this time with people being separated, it was in a much more digital and fulsome form. So people got a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, but that was dealt with by leadership, and it's. I guess the question really is, how did the progressives succeed in driving the conversation of what the legislature was doing? Perhaps that's really what is being asked here. And were they able to do it within the traditional context? So I'll take that, first part first, did they drive the conversation? Of course, to a certain degree, yes. You could not ignore the growth of that constituency, especially if you're a Democratic legislator in the city, but also outside the city as well. So, you couldn't ignore those voices. But secondly, how did they impact the process? I don't know, I think the process functioned pretty well. Things certainly got discussed, maybe not in the form that people would have wanted them to. I was reading something today about, some of the bills that didn't get done, and well, maybe we should have, brought them up and discussed them on the floor, and that somehow that adds luster to the discussion. And if that's your goal, okay, then maybe you weren't successful, but I do think you could say that these issues were definitely addressed and attacked and discussed any number of ways, through conference, through committees, through hearings. There's lots of different ways to deal with issues. And I do think the progressives had an impact on that. I don't know that they necessarily changed the process any, but I don't know that that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the progressives and the DSA folks and to some extent the Working Families Party folks, and some tell themselves are the exact same people. I think that what they've shown is that their members that are here will bring up topics and push topics. More importantly for them, they've got what, 9 races that they've targeted in the assembly. And so they're basically saying to the speaker and the leadership team that he has is that we are going to keep coming after you. And that, so in some ways they're not traditional in the fact that with like other constituencies, you can satisfy their needs. I don't think for the progressives that there is a satisfying of their needs, so that they will continue. I mean, the thing that I think if I'm the speaker, I'm saying that no matter, they're coming after me, and my members. And I think Tuesday's gonna be real interesting.
Well,
Thank you. No, I just, one thing I want to add is I think that you see as the younger members come in, this sort of, and this repeats across generations, but this idea of like, maybe not necessarily that the system is broken, but that you see the seams beginning to show, and that the incrementalism that has always worked there isn't good enough for the DSA folks, like you were saying. That's why they will keep throwing themselves at these races, because they want to have their social media presences, and they want to come up and be activists as well, and they really want to see big bills pass.
well, yeah, and I think, that's the point I was going to make. And it's, it's more so that you see it in the Democratic Party than you do in the Republican Party. But, even going back, to the 60s, what you see is this notion that if my issue isn't done the way I want it, then the system is broken and we have to change the system. And that is, a through line for reforms in the Democratic side for 50, 60 years. So everything old is new again. And, if my thing doesn't get done, it's because the system is broken, not because there's anything wrong with my thing.
All right, so I just want to remind people, if you have a question and you're in the audience, right, you've got that Q&A box on the bottom sort of menu bar on your screen. So you want to click that, type your question into the chat box that pops up, hit enter, and then we'll ask it on air to one of our 3 panelists today. The second audience question we had was, how is it different conducting, or just the experience of a legislative session under Cuomo versus Hochul? So as much as you're willing to say about that, we'd love to hear. I don't know.
Well, because the Buffalo News called you.
No, I mean, I think there was, I think you have 2 entirely different ways of going about session. And again, she's, we talk about Hochul like she's been here forever, and she has not been here forever. This is her first session, first time through. But I think one of the things that, you kept hearing from legislators is that they were not afraid to engage with the second floor, that the second floor, that they felt that they could dialogue back and forth. I think that she did not choose a lot of legislative issues to get involved in until we saw what happened with gun violence and abortion and things like that. And then they made a very clear determination that they were going to nationalize the agenda here and what was going on. And which I thought was really, really good politics for her. And so she, at the end, came in very, very hard, nationalizing the agenda on gun control and the issue of choice, and really put a flag in the ground on that.
When you say nationalization, you just sort of briefly say what you mean by that.
Well, so what was happening with both the leaked Supreme Court case and what was happening with, here in New York, we had the Buffalo, massacre, but also what happened in Texas, you had a huge gun debate going on, which then ends up in a Supreme Court case after session is ended. And those are topics that she really emphasized. They were topics that were number 1 and 2 in the national news, and they became 1 and 2 in New York. We weren't talking about 421A. She wasn't talking about 421A. She wasn't talking about, buying more parkland at the Adirondack. She came out and used her political capital on the issue of choice and guns.
Anybody else? Differences?
Yeah, and I think, Ed touched on this, the willingness of the legislature and the excessiveness of the governor's office towards the end of, and throughout session, really. I mean, there was, with the previous governor, there was generally a statement sometime after the budget was passed that, well, session's done, everything that is important has been done, see you later.
Yeah.
And then at some point during the last week of session, this governor would pop back up and say, oh no, but I got all these things that are important. And, that didn't happen this way. To the extent that Governor Hochul was putting things on the table, it was being driven by events and by national politics, and by the interests of the people of the state of New York as well. I mean, it's not just the nation that she was talking to. So, it was a very different way of going about the end of session.
Well, even just like nominations. Remember nominations? Nobody knows who's being nominated until like 3 minutes before they were nominated. They didn't have enough time to do it. They had to set them up until the last. I mean, if you notice, we did the confirmation process. It was like everybody knew who the confirmation people. There wasn't any of the chaos.
Still happened in the middle of the night, but yes.
But it wasn't. Yeah, it was just it was a whole different way of doing it.
Okay, so I want to sort of go on to the Supreme Court aspect of what we just talked about. NPR had an analysis over the weekend that says we have the most conservative Supreme Court in the last 75 years, right? We had blockbuster decisions that overturned a century-old gun law in New York, right? We eliminated the constitutional right to abortion. Now we're seeing more religious influence in public life and even in access to public spending, right? So if you put these ideas to a vote in New York, you probably don't get the results that we got from the Supreme Court. What are New York politicians doing about that, both in the political rhetoric, but actually in the policy action as well?
Well, I mean, we'll have a better idea Thursday when the special session occurs and what they address there. I am not fully facile with the gun decision, but I don't know how much room the legislature has to operate to, do anything, unless, of course, we're going to begin in this never-ending cycle of states passing laws that they think are going to be either overturned or trying to bring the question to the court, and we're just going to be in this sort of endless. They used to call the states the laboratory of democracy, and it could just become a Frankenstein's monster of democracy, which every state taking their view on things and trying to enforce that on everybody else. Not to get, way off track here, but it isn't, legally it is similar to what you saw prior to the Civil War with the fugitive slave laws and things like that, with southern states attempting to vitiate northern laws about the protection of freed African Americans. So you're seeing these lines, sort of legal lines, being drawn in abortion, with certain states trying to figure out how to enforce their laws on people who leave their states to go exercise rights somewhere else. It's a place that this country hasn't been in a really, really long time. Legally, it's very interesting. We'll go with that. And, I'm not really sure where it's all going to play out. It's all very fresh. And I think people are still sorting out what to do, how to navigate, what is the best course of action. You see states like New York saying we're going to beef up our protections of, the people in our state and their rights. And we'll just see how this all plays out. But yeah, I'll leave it there. I don't know if anybody else has any sort of.
No, I agree with you, Doug. I think we're really right at the beginning of this, and it is really, you don't want to get over dramatic, but you are setting up, but we are, I mean, we are, the questions of can, drugs move across state lines? If you're a woman in Missouri, you have to take a pregnancy test before you leave. I mean, these are the kind of, it sounds crazy, but that's the kind of thing we're setting up. I saw yesterday, the largest tech company in Pennsylvania sent a thing out to politicians on both sides saying, I just want you to know that you guys all cite us as a reason that we're an economic development engine here in Pennsylvania. I want you to know that we will not continue to invest in Pennsylvania if the right to choice is taken away from women. So these things are going to start, Dick's Sporting Goods said to each one of their folks that they will spend up to $4,000 to give them safe and legal services. So you see these things starting, and this is within 48 hours, right? So where do we go? 72, and we always used to say all politics is local, and Hochul made a decision that for the people of New York, what was happening in the Supreme Court was upsetting of the way that we've lived in this state. And so you're wondering now if we're starting to, is Tip O'Neill right anymore? Is all politics local, or are all these things starting to get really nationalized? And it's going to be interesting to see that and how this plays out this fall at both, the Assembly, Senate, and statewide races.
It's ironic, the decision meant to throw things back to the states might end up nationalizing things more than.
Exactly.
All right, so this brings us on to the special session. It was called initially for the purpose of addressing this ruling on guns from the Supreme Court. Do we think that abortion will make its way in there? And then also, if I'm an advocate or I have a priority that wasn't done in the legislature during the proper session, right? I'm thinking, oh, can I get my thing in? And I wonder, can I get my issue on the table now? And also, B, will they be taking up abortion?
I mean, I think the easy answer to the latter question is no. I think there's a bunch of people, and we're all used to getting a bunch of phone calls saying, hey, can we get this thing that didn't get done in session done now? These are very, very narrowly defined day that they'll be coming up for, but they want to come in, make a big splash, do something to take back to their constituents and say, New York cares about you, we are the Empire State for a reason. Everything else we'll deal with in January.
Right, I mean, theoretically, because the legislature never gavels out, there's always the opportunity to, have your issue brought up. But, the analogy we always use is, once you open the cookie jar, it's really hard to stop, the kids and Cookie Monster from, eating everything inside there. So the leadership and legislature and really in the legislators themselves, it doesn't do them any good to reopen all of these things. Especially since, again, it's going to happen in between our bifurcated primaries. Do the bifurcated primaries, though, give impetus to some of the folks who have the second half of the primary, see what happens in the first half and say, well, now you have to do this because now I'm in trouble because the Assembly didn't do this and they got attacked for it. So, we'll see. There's a lot of cards to play, and people will play them, but generally you don't open the cookie jar.
Yeah, I don't think they'll open the cookie jar, but I do think choice becomes a major topic. We have the first woman governor. We have Tish James, who's been a real leader in the AG state AGs. I know that the Democratic AGs, there's actually more Democratic AGs than there are Republican AGs. So I know that they see themselves on the front line here. So, you have strong women leadership in New York. And with this decision coming down, I think it's really hard for New York to come back and do a special session and not in some way deal with the choice issue and what we're going to do here. So I expect that by Thursday, they'll have, I know Kruger's put together a new piece. I think, I find it hard to believe that by Thursday that they won't have a three-way on what they want to do on the choice question along with the gun question.
I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I mean, you did have Clarence Thomas in his concurrence basically putting a target on some other substantive due process rights.
Yeah.
And so again, does the fact that you have a lot of things that you're trying to protect make it more difficult to focus and, you know, not do all of them? I don't know.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's where the choice issue is slightly different from the gun issue, because, you know, there are other substantive due process rights that are clearly hanging out there for certainly at least one justice on the Supreme Court. I don't want to speak for any more of them, that, you know, there's more work to be done.
So circling back around, now that we've sort of nationalized the issues in New York, it seems like we're talking a lot about the culture war issues, right? We saw that's what is going to get done in the special session. That's a lot of what got done at the end of the session. Where does that leave our local issues? When can they get looked at?
I think they did. I mean, you gotta, you know, we talked about how many bills they did. A lot of that is real localized, New York centric things. So I think in a lot of ways, they did that. They did the blocking and tackling of making sure that they did the localized thing that stakeholders in the political process and legislative process. I think a lot of that work got done. A lot of that work got done in the budget. There are some big overarching issues that didn't get done, but I think part of that was a decision by the legislative leaders and folks that let's see, get the governor, let her run, let her be reelected, let her have her team in place for a year, and you know, we'll come back with new Senate, we'll come back with new Assembly, and we'll tackle some of the more difficult, because you know, as Doug and Phil said, it's on some of these issues, it's hard when you don't know who your constituencies are exactly. The legislators will know who their constituencies are after November, make it easier for them to do that kind of work, I think. So I think they did a lot of their local work.
Fascinating. Okay, so one big locality is New York City. They had a new mayor coming into this session, Eric Adams, and he came to Albany with legislative priorities. What were those priorities and how did he fare?
Well, I think what the mayor learned is that even though you used to be a senator, once you become the mayor, it's a totally different relationship with New York State government. And, you know, it's much more difficult to get your priorities done as the mayor to free New York City from the shackles of Albany. So what were some of his priorities? You had, well, I mean, one of them was bail reform, and depending on who you ask, whether that was done or not done, or the reform of bail reform, I guess is the better way to put it. Something was done in that area, whether it was enough to satisfy anybody is open to question, and you know, the elections will help give an answer to that. You had mayoral control of schools. He wanted a longer period of time. That did not happen. What else? Am I leaving out?
He did 421A. He wanted to get done.
421A did not happen. But this is, you know, this is something, as I said, that New York City mayors have run into from time immemorial. That you know, it's tough to get things done in Albany when you're the mayor of New York City.
Why is that, Doug?
Well, because it's really difficult to ask people to give up power once they have power. And the New York legislature has had the ability over New York City for hundreds of years, and you know, we really don't want to give it up. And also, I mean, you've got a sizable number of legislators from the New York City area, and they want to have a say on these things too. And if you divest yourself as a state legislator of your ability to influence city issues, it's, you know, becomes a little bit tougher for you to promote yourself and to do your job as well. I mean, that's part of the reason why these folks run to get elected from New York City, is to be able to have control over local issues. So why would you divest yourself of the reason why you're going in the first place?
Which goes for the governor also.
All right, so a lot of continuity in that topic. If you've listened to us so far and you're at home, you notice we haven't really talked a lot about the Republicans. My question now, where were the Republicans this session? What was their story and how are they capitalizing on this redistricting plan, if at all?
Well, I think the Republican, I mean, they were really, really brilliant in how they handled the redistricting thing. I mean, they literally they went judge shopping. They found a judge in a area that was favorable to them. I mean, they completely derailed what was happening here in New York. No matter what happens, the fact that New York was going to pick up maybe 3 to 6 congressional seats in a year that's going to be really, really red, if the control of the House is with, that close, the fact that the Republicans in New York were able to take those, you saw Texas redistricting and Florida redistricting and these, gerrymandered districts that were so favorable to the Republican Party. In New York was one of the places where the Democrats had that opportunity, and the Republicans were able to completely stymie them. And I think one of the shocks to a lot of people in the system was the court when it threw out I think everybody thought, well, that court is a court that was, nominated by Democrats, and most of them were Andrew Cuomo appointees, and they're going to look the other way, and they totally did not. And in fact, we're really, really tough on the Democratic plans. And so, I think the most significant thing that the Republicans gained was what happened nationally for them here in New York. I'm not sure it may help them on the margins in the Assembly and Senate and picking up some seats. I think in Long Island, they are very optimistic about picking up some seats. That may be offset with some things upstate, but depending on voter turnout and things like that, they got as much as they possibly could out of this process. I mean, if there's a winner in the apportionment, it's the Republicans.
Brilliant. So the question from the audience we just got, and we're going to ask now, is there any issue you were surprised did not get done during the session and is not expected to get done during the special session?
I think at the beginning of session, not that anyone really expected it would get done, but with it being Assemblyman Gottfried's last session, I think at least we had told clients that there would probably be some sort of conversation around the New York Health Act. Obviously, there is a massive, incalculable economic.
Can you just explain a little bit what that is?
Yes, so the New York Health Act was New York's single-payer health bill. It's been passed in the Assembly a bunch of times over the years, and a big part of when the Democrats retook the Senate was that this would be a thing that would finally be within striking distance and achievable. And again, Assemblyman Gottfried, who's been championing it for forever, is leaving or is done with the session. And I think that, again, there was just a belief that it would be something that would at least be talked about more, and it sort of fizzled out, didn't really get brought up at all during the session.
Doug, anything surprise you?
Well, I think, when you take a look at a lot of, because we talked about this earlier, the big issues, big environmental changes, big changes to healthcare, big changes to transportation. There's the nuts and bolts of trying to put all that together. And then of course, there's, the reality, the consequences of making these big changes is something that, because when you come to Albany and your idea is unveiled, the rest of the world gets to have a say at it. And, it's sometimes the real world brings up legitimate points. And so it's a little difficult to change gears in the middle of a session when you've had a plan like this that has been around for how long. It's a big idea, but it's also really difficult for one state to set up such a thing. And while if any year the discussion might have happened, it was this year because of all the money that was flowing in, you were still talking billions and billions of dollars for a long time. Now, the flip side, the advocates will talk about, we have to look at all the people that you are helping and all the folks that you are saving. and all of the money you're saving by getting people healthcare earlier and all of that. It's a push and pull, and it's a very difficult conversation to have. And as we discussed, all the other things that fed into this, redistricting, COVID, everything else, it's really hard to have that conversation in a year like this.
And anything you were surprised by?
No.
I like.
And it's
it.
never
Yeah,
surprised.
I'm never surprised.
You know.
It's went exactly like I thought.
Okay, so now I want to pivot to just a couple specific issues, but people at home do know that we have time for one or two more questions. If you type them in, we will ask them. So I think a lot of people forget while session's happening, there's also a lot happening sort of off the political main stage in the agencies. One agency doing yeoman's work this year was the Office of Cannabis Management that was publishing just reams of regulations. Phil, can I ask you, what do we know now that we didn't know when session started, just from the Office of Cannabis Management, and were there any surprises in their regulations?
I think the program took a little bit longer to get up and running than I think most people were expecting and hoping for, but again, they were building it from scratch. I think the effort that they've put into really building up a social equity program has been fantastic for everyone to see. I think the buy-in that they've had for this provisional hemp cultivators license, so farmers around New York State are going to be able to grow and sell cannabis, has really taken off. I think they're somewhere around 200 licenses now that they've issued for that. Just last week, they got around to naming a chief equity officer, so they're really going to be able to work on implementing a lot of the outstanding regulations and license types to really get this up and running.
So why is it that position?
Yeah, so the chief equity officer was the one remaining position that had to be filled through the MRTA, which is the bill to legalize adult use cannabis, that they, they've been interviewing folks for, and they landed on someone with a lot of experience. Who's a farmer who I think will bring a lot over to the agency. And between that and then finally assembling the cannabis advisory board, I think they're in a really good spot to, over the summer and fall, get it up and running.
Brilliant. So that seems like it's coming along. But then we've got to pivot back to politics here, right? So we know if you're buying cannabis in New York right now, you're not buying it from a licensed vendor unless it's medical, right? Has there been any action taken on enforcement?
There were some cease and desist letters sent. It's very difficult, and I think that we've seen this play out in state after state that have had legalization to deal with the illicit market. And the hope is that through the social equity program and through the retail licenses that are going to folks that have been justice involved, they'll be able to bring a level of expertise and community engagement into the program that will curtail the illicit market more than any other program in any other state have really been able to accomplish.
Were there any attempts to do it legislatively though?
There was a bill that was pushed in the last few days of session that sort of fizzled out, but that's been kind of the only real conversation about working on the legislative so far.
But I think that's also a good example of, again, we go back to the big issues. And, that was a big issue that theoretically you would think would be easy to do. Other states have done it. Why can't you just do it that way? Well, as it turns out, the way other states have done it hasn't really worked out as well as everybody hoped. So using that experience, New York is trying to build a better mousetrap, but that takes time and that takes effort, and it takes, really trying to learn from other places. It's not just pick it up and drop it in New York, and there you've got a fully cultivated and grown market, as it were.
All right. So do I have an extra question? Not yet. So I have one last where I want to pull this all together. I want to see how the politics affected the policy, and I want to talk about the environment there, right? So if you look at the proposals around the environment, we came into session, people wanted to do all electric buildings, right? We wanted to spend so much more money. There were lots of ideas out there. You might be able to tell me more of what some of them were. But the one big one that we really got, right, was we have a ban on crypto mining that's done with fossil fuel. Why did we get that one and the other ones didn't work?
So I guess I'll start on this one. I think part of the reason why you got that one is I mean, crypto is sort of a niche thing still. It's not, you know, it's tech bros, it's billionaires, it's libertarians, and other assorted folks. And so it's not, you know, a huge market of people who are deeply invested in it. Secondly, it does use a lot of energy. And when you're looking to reduce CO2 emissions, you know, it's kind of the lowest hanging fruit there is. So that's why, you know, you kind of end up with that one. And then, you know, reality interceding at the time, and you've seen it only accelerate, you know, crypto is losing value. You know, it was sold at one point as a hedge against inflation. Well, looks like that's not the case. So it was really one of the things that was able to get done. Now on the electric buildings thing, one of the things that sort of was working against that is the fact that New York has a test for this. The city of Ithaca is, you know, looking to do this, and they have enacted an ordinance to do this. So there is kind of a, well, let's see what happens. What can we learn from this before we go, you know, everywhere with it? And it's, you know, kind of our own little laboratory. So that's my take on it. Ed, do you have crypto?
Yeah. I put all the money in these. So but yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that building decarbonization, you're in the middle of the CLCPA, you're doing scoping hearings right now. And you had some major concepts put before the legislature, building decarbonization, getting NYPA involved in renewables, things like that. And they're really reordering major parts of your economy, and coming out of COVID, which is going to see major reordering of New York City's economy and other downtowns economy. I think there's a lot there, and I think the governor and the legislature basically said, hey, let's get farther down the road on this. Let's get the scoping process farther down the road, and then let's come back to these when we have a little bit, you know, better idea of what the economy is going to look like, what the new world looks like, with returning to downtowns and things like that. Let's see what the scoping comes up with, and then let's get a legislature that's been reelected and back and knows who they're representing, and a governor that's been here for a year. And I assume that the issues that you will see them take bigger, you know, a look at these major pieces. I worked on a piece on thermal networks, which involved environmentalists, labor, and utilities, which is a building block for how you do building decarbonization. I think you need to do a lot of these little things before you do the big thing.
Brilliant. So we have 4 minutes left. My last question is, do you have any final thoughts that you want to give us on the session? Or if there's something I didn't ask that you think is really important for people to know, or is there a big lesson that you think you could sort of extract from all the happenings? So whichever way you want to take the final thought, and I want to start with you.
Okay. Look, I think there was a lot of, if you looked at this legislature and you looked at the things that happened during it, you know, all the things that happened between January and June in New York. If you had told me that the legislature had completely gone out of control and that nothing got done and there was a lot of animosity and things like that, I could see that. I think that the leaders took some really tough situations and landed the plane. And that we had, for the most part, a very successful budget and a very successful legislative session. And I think, I believe this budget and this legislative session 3 or 4 years from now, we'll look back and say, wow, look at what we were able to do during a really, really disruptive time frame. It'll go down as an incredibly productive and well-run session.
I mean, we've seen all kinds of things over the years, scandals and whatnot that come up during session that grind things to a halt. That, nothing happens for weeks on end. And you had a succession of events that could have done that, but really didn't. I think that is the testament to everybody involved, that didn't happen, and that as much was accomplished. Is that even a sentence? I'm not even sure. I think it is, looking back on it, if you would have told me these things would happen, I'd well, nothing's getting done this year. And that is not what happened at all.
Yeah, from the lieutenant governor to the tragedy in Buffalo to everything in between, it felt like once a week we were getting hit with what would have been a bombshell any other year. And to be able to exit all of that with the Supreme Court acting the way it is, knowing they have to go back to the special session and the legislature just tackling all of that head on and being able to tie up everything as neat as they can, I think sets a good precedent for, even though it's going to be a new legislature coming in next year, sets a good precedent for what they can do under times of extreme change. And I hope that they're able to maintain that moving forward.
All right, well, time dictates that we have to leave it there. Thank you all for your absolutely brilliant comments today. Specifically, I want to say thank you to Ed Driggs, Doug Clark, Phil Boland. I also want to thank you if you're out there in the digital audience
Still there.
for attending. Thank you for doing so. Have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.